because it was too dangerous to go out. And finally, he got out on forged UN papers. So this time, our colleagues said, please don't even think about coming to Iraq, because not only is it going to be a danger to you, but it's going to be a danger to us to have you around. So we did our work with them just across the border in Jordan with this. But in the 2004 survey, we had 33 clusters. So those were 33 different locations, which we allocated by random, again according to the estimates of population size and distribution. Each cluster contained 30 households, and in all we had 988 households and 7,800 people in this survey. Now from that, we recorded deaths starting in January 2002. We didn't ask people, did the death occur before the invasion or after the invasion? We just said, when did it occur? And then in the analysis, we looked out which came before and which came after the invasion. We recorded the causes of death, and from the number of deaths, we calculated rates. So for all the people we had, as the denominator, how many deaths were there, the numerator, and then we calculated according to various causes. And we did this in what is known as a cohort or retrospective cohort study. So we compared households with themselves. So we said, what was this household like in the period of time before the invasion, and then what's happened afterwards? So we were comparing people against themselves for the households. And the first step was to select where these 30 households were in each cluster. So this one we did back in 2004 using GPS. So we would go around a village or a community or neighborhood and with a GPS unit, and using that we would calculate an imaginary grid 100 meters apart from each other, and then we would randomly select the site. We would use the GPS unit to go to that site, and that would be the first house that we would do, and then 29 households in addition to that, contiguous with each other, we would then visit and get our data in that direction. And in that time, we found 46 deaths before the invasion, 142 after the invasion. We calculated a crude mortality rate before the invasion of 5.0 and afterwards of 7.9. Now, one of the big differences was the number of deaths due to violence. Now, our definition of violence wasn't car crashes or roof falling in on the house, but these were intentional violence. So they would be things like gunshots, missiles, and so forth. And there were a few deaths before the invasion that were violent. And many of these were probably, or these, not many, there were only a couple, but these were associated probably with incidents around the no-fly zones and the process of radar units locking on to airplanes and then firing back at the artillery and missile sites and so forth. But after the invasion, half of the deaths we found were due to violent causes. Now, in this survey, we had a bit of a problem, a serious methodologic problem, and that is one of the clusters we randomly chose was Fallujah. And this was in September, July and September of 2004, before the big strikes on Fallujah in November. However, there was so much death and in Fallujah that it really skewed things really badly. So in the end, we decided in our analysis to leave Fallujah out. And I'll show you what that would do to calculations in a minute. But excluding Fallujah, at that point we estimated, applying the rates to the overall population of Iraq, that there were 98,000 excess deaths. So this means deaths that occurred beyond what would normally occur. Now, under normal circumstances, no conflict in Iraq, we could probably expect around 150,000 deaths every year from old age, from cancer, from heart disease, and so forth. Well, these are deaths above that. Now, we got a huge amount of criticism for these confidence intervals, and I'll come to this confidence intervals in just a bit. But we had a confidence interval at the low end of 8,000, at the high end of 194,000. Now, this is what, these were the deaths pre-invasion. 2% were due to violence, and afterwards is 51%. Now, this is what the confidence intervals would look like. There is a 10% probability that it was less than 44,000, and only a 2.5% chance it was less less than 8,000. If we put Fallujah into it, the top end of the confidence intervals would be infinity. It really skewed things so badly that we decided we would just leave this out and be conservative in this. But as I mentioned, we got a lot of criticism for this. This is one of the pictures snapped in Fallujah. Widespread destruction. I might add that in the second survey, I intentionally asked the team to oversample in Fallujah to take 3 samples, if they chose Fallujah in the random selection, which indeed happened. And so we did 3 samples, 3 clusters instead of the 1 which the population would have merited. And then we randomly selected 1 of the 3, which turned out to be the one that had the lowest mortality in the 3 clusters. But the experience in the first one was really true to what we found in the subsequent one. There was very, very widespread destruction in Fallujah. Nearly every household had lost somebody in that survey. Okay, so in 2006, in working with John, we went back to look at things again from May to July of 2006. And as John knows, we had a great intention to get this out as early as we could before the elections, so we would not be again accused of trying to do something with the elections. But one thing and another, movement of money, ethical approvals and so forth, we didn't get it done quite as soon as we would have liked. But in this one, we did more clusters. We did 47 clusters this time. We had a larger sample size, and we spent a huge amount of time dissecting the previous data to figure out what's the ideal size to have in a cluster. Some people were pumping for 45, but in the end we chose for 40 clusters. And in this one we had 12,000 individuals instead of 9,000, and we had 1,800 households. And as I say, we finished this at the end of July. Now, this is how it actually worked out. Baghdad, which has about a quarter of the population or slightly more, got 12 clusters. So and then it went down according to populations. Now, the last 2 probably should have gotten included, but because of some mix-ups in communication, they did not get sampled. The second stage was to assign the clusters within the governorates proportionate to their size, and the third was to identify the start house, which is the house you want to start at. And we had multiple options. One of the things that we were thinking very much about was using GPS units again. But our surveyor said, no, not this time. If you go out with this thing in your hand, people are going to think either that is a remote detonator or that you're going to call in some kind of airstrike. And in either case, no matter what they're thinking, your life expectancy is about 45 seconds at that point. So we said, okay, we'll have to do something different. There's several other approaches, but we decided to look at random selection of the streets, and I'll show you how we did that in a moment. Here's one of our team, and we had an interesting approach to sampling. The team were all doctors from the community medicine departments in Baghdad. They went out house to house in their white coats, so they couldn't be mistaken for being somebody else. They first off rounded up the children to explain what this survey was about, sent out the children to the households to explain to the neighbors what was going on and so forth, to try to reduce the risks that were involved. Now, ideally, if we were trying to reduce the effects that clustering have. Now, statistically, cluster surveys have a problem, and that is houses that are close together tend to be quite similar to each other. So if you were to do this, ideally you'd say, okay, I'm going to do this house, then I'm going to skip 2 or 3 houses, then I'm going to do the next house, then I'll skip 2 or 3 houses, and I'll do the next one. Gives you a bit more spread, and it reduces this effect of clustering. Well, we felt if we did that, it was going to increase the risk for the interviewers as well. And as some of you may have known, interviewers have died in the process of doing surveys in Iraq. So this is not something to be taken lightly. So we kept them fairly compact, and I'm happy to say that there were no deaths or injuries to our survey team, although there were some scary times along the way. So we had pairs, male and female. Generally speaking, women will speak to women. So if the head of the household who was home or the person who was home was a woman, the male interviewer would often go to the next house and get started there. So with these two pair of interviewers for each of the clusters of 40 households, we were able to finish a cluster in a day. One of the things we did not want to do is to come back the next day. Now, in many kind of surveys, you wouldn't have any problem coming back. In fact, you'd want to do that. You want to check up on a certain percent of your surveys to be sure that you got the straight, accurate information. But in this case, we decided that's too risky to do that. In order to be included as a death in the household, you had to have been living in that household for 3 months beforehand. So that reduced the chance of people just passing through getting included. The first time we asked, back in 2004, we asked for death certificates in a few households. There was some fear that asking for death certificates might be seen to be doubting people and so forth. But households were very agreeable at this in 2004. So this time, our intent was to ask every household where a death is reported for a death certificate. Now, if you've done survey work, you know you don't always get all the answers you want. And in this case, in 13% of cases, the interviewers forgot to ask for the death certificate. But when they did ask, 92% of households had a death certificate, which says a lot of things about the vital registration system, the importance of death certificates, and so forth in Iraq in the past. So this is how we did this kind of thing. This is a Google Earth picture. So if we selected a neighborhood like this, then what we would do would be to list the main streets like this. Then we would select one of the main streets at random, in this case maybe this one, and then we would list all the residential streets that either crossed it or were in that immediate area, and then we randomly selected one of these side streets to survey. Then we numbered the houses on the side street, and then we randomly selected one of those to start. Once we had the start house, then we went door to door until we got the 40 nearest households. So if we looked at things, we would have said, in this cluster, this is the area that we sampled. Again, you can see there is this kind of problem with clustering. Houses have a certain similarity, but in the analysis and so forth, you account for this type of effect. So these were our findings, and we went back to that same period of time, January 2002, because we wanted to have a check on our previous data. One of the problems with this kind of survey is what we call recall bias. People may forget things, but in the case of death, usually don't forget them. But you often forget exactly when they occurred. Maybe it was in December, and actually it was in January, or you're a month or two off. So we wanted to go back and check on what we found previously. So what we found in the households that we randomly selected, and we went back to completely different clusters. Some of the clusters were in the same town, but we never went to, in the random selection process, we never randomly selected the same neighborhood or the same village as we did before. 11 of the clusters in the second survey were in the same geographic area as the 33 clusters in the first survey, but they weren't in the same specific areas. We found a crude mortality rate of 5.5. So that's close to the 5.0 that we found the first time. And then over the period of time, the 3 years after the invasion, we found a crude mortality rate had risen to 13.2 per thousand per year. So more than doubling the mortality rate. And we had calculated our sample size to be more than adequate to measure a doubling of the crude mortality rate. So we met that. The leading cause of death we found were gunshot wounds, and there were a lot more recently of deaths from car bombs, but still, even in July or August of 2006, gunshot wounds were the major cause of death. And then we calculated a violent mortality rate. So this is a cause-specific mortality rate, which was 7.2 per thousand per year. And 91% of these violent deaths were among males. And I'll come back to this in a minute here. Now, one of the things we always want to look at is how are our data distributed? Are they skewed particularly in one direction or another? Well, these are the number of violent deaths per thousand per year, and these are These are the number of clusters in the